Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 326, Vegetarianism in the Light of Theosophy. Link in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links to my books, blogs. Haven't done the actual blog of it yet. This is only 30 pages. This is actually an oratory lecture that was given by Annie Besant, Theosophical manuscript, a live lecture. And what happened back then is people often would go to lectures and then students would transcribe it. This was presumably transcribed by some random student. Besant herself wouldn't have been the one actually typing it up. And for decades, almost a half century, she was actually doing lectures like this. There's hundreds of them available. I'm editing another one now. It's slightly longer. But people would go to oratory because you didn't have TV. You had radio by this point in the 30s and 40s, but you didn't have television. So people would go and they would listen to people speak or debate. And this particular, it's interesting because this is really more of a moral than a dietary tract. It focuses on the ethical side and the spiritual principle of vegetarianism. Theosophists, even as late as the late 1800s, were already stressing that vegetarianism was spiritually significant and that the idea by this point, and she ruminates on Chicago, which at the time, at the turn of the century, was basically one big slaughterhouse. That was basically why Chicago existed. It's a nice central location for slaughtering meat before sending it to all parts of the United States. The idea was that slaughterhouses were particularly unpleasant and that you could literally feel the fear and the suffering there. And I'm assuming probably that's true. Because there would have been gutters filled with blood and offal and feral animals eating the scraps, and it would have been not a very nice place to be. Like, if you think Chicago is butcherous now, it's just doing the same thing it's been doing for a century anyway. It's the norm. Having a bunch of shootings and death in Chicago, if you didn't have that, it wouldn't be Chicago. Just look at their dietary systems. But vegetarianism was considered to be spiritually enlightening. The idea was that if you were constantly eating meat and partaking in slaughter, because either you or someone else had to kill it before eating it, that this was a drain on your karma, and that it wasn't particularly good for you. You have the option, because you're a human, because you have full cognition, as opposed to an animal that's lesser in the cognitive state, a lesser animal. You have the ability to potentially transcend the normal physical form and become a much more enlightened being over the course of multiple human lives. But that if you're eating meat, this won't happen. Specifically, it's incapable of happening because you're causing harm and fear and negativity as opposed to causing good things in the world. And of course, it's interesting because the first mention of veganism that I ever saw in literature actually comes from a theosophical work as well. I can't remember the title of it, but it mentions it briefly and says, well, only a very small number of people are going to get to the point where they're capable of eating no animal products. We just recommend vegetarianism. That's enough. So you can maintain the milk and the butter and things like that. As long as the animal didn't suffer. Of course, I agree that's also ethically equivalent to veganism. I don't like factory farming. That's not much different from a slaughterhouse. But in this particular sense, it's more ethical. And she does touch on the fact that it's healthier, but says, well, for the purposes of this particular lecture, I'm not going to focus on that. I'm focused on what's going to happen to you when you die if you eat too many hamburgers. It's very interesting. Of course, I do believe that vegetarianism is ethically enlightened. I also think certainly it's healthier than eating a bunch of especially processed meat. That being said, I'm not sure I believe in karma particularly, but it's an interesting lecture anyway, presented in book form. I will be doing several other of these lectures by Besant. I'm going to try to focus on the ones, though, that are a little bit longer. Again, this is only 30 pages, so it's a relatively short read, but it is an interesting primary source document. It's more or less verbatim, with the exception of a few spelling errors that I redacted. Basically, that was it for editing. So again, link in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon, second and third links to my books, blogs. That's about all. Peace out.